Okay, so the reason I brought this book up, you can see how thick it is. This is the compilation of what we've been working on. We meet monthly. A couple cases we've met twice a month to get us down to what we call the vital few, or our funding scenarios. I'd like to just quickly talk a little bit about the criteria that we use, because when you have 40 different funding scenarios, and they were all over the board, I mean, it was wide open about what would be some sources of funding that we could use. So in order to narrow these down, we developed criteria that the Legislative Task Force strongly supported. So is the funding sufficient to meet the needs? Is the funding sustainable? Is the funding stable and flexible? Is the funding diverse and equitable? Does the funding diversify or enhance engagement? Is the funding cost effective? Is the funding defensible? Is the funding politically feasible? And last but not least, is the funding politically insulated? So that's the criteria that we used for what Jim talked about with the 40 to bring us down to where we are today. And again, we are not done. We still are considering options. So these are the two that have surfaced with the task force for further discussion. And we're in the process right now of taking these concepts out to various interest groups and asking them, you know, what's their opinion on that? Using the criteria that we've developed, this is where we're coming into. One is an income tax surcharge. There's two options with that. A $20 to $25 surcharge on individual tax returns. Low income filers and license holders would be exempt from that surcharge, and low income is defined as $20,000 per year. 64 to $80 million is a potential revenue that could be raised in the biennium. Option two would be a 1% surtax on individual tax returns. Low income filers and license holders would be exempt. 120 million in potential revenue per biennium. The other that the task force zeroed in on was the beverage container law, and OLCC just this last week approved moving that to 10 cents, and I think it goes into effect in 2018. So that's going to go from 5 cents to 10 cents. So option one would be an additional 1 to 2.5 cent tax on beverage containers subject to the deposit law, would bring in between 33 and 82 million potential revenue. Option two, 1 to 3% tax on beverage containers subject to the deposit law, 40 to 118 million dollars in potential revenue. And we had Beth Petrino from Legislative Services. We've had the services of her at the legislature of Legislative Revenue Office to help provide us with some what we think are somewhat factual figures to be able to use so we can get a good handle on what the potential revenue would be. So that's what the task force is exploring right now. We aren't final yet by any means, but this is something that we want to take out to the various interest groups. And it's not just the normal interest groups that ODF&W usually deals with. We want to talk to the Association of Oregon Industries. I've already talked to the Association of Oregon Counties and League of Oregon Cities, and we want to talk to other urban kind of interest groups, as well as the normal interest groups that you work with on almost a daily basis. So we're in the process of doing that now.
So I want to take just a couple minutes to share with you some results from a public opinion survey we conducted early in this process. So we contracted with Responsive Management, who's worked for the department before, to do a statewide statistically valid survey. Ended up being 900 Oregonians throughout the state. And the purpose was to assess opinions on the department and values related to management of fish and wildlife resources in the state. And the results are good news, bad news. The good news is that there's a very high satisfaction rate with the department's management of fish and wildlife and the habitat associated with that. 65% satisfied or very satisfied. and very small percentage, 12% dissatisfied. And our consultant told us that that's one of the best results they've ever seen in their nationwide work. In terms of the availability of opportunities for fishing and hunting recreation, we had 47% of the respondents say it was excellent, 34% good, so you can see there's a very small percentage of folks who felt that the opportunities aren't out there. We asked about the department's credibility, and 88% of the respondents find the department credible or very credible. And they particularly cited the department's website as the best information available on fish and wildlife resources in the state. When we asked about the values associated with fish and wildlife resources out there, the ecological functions popped to the top, high at the top. So much higher than recreation access. The bad news is that folks have no idea how the department is funded. The majority of folks thought you're entirely funded by state general taxes. Only 30% of the respondents understood the importance of license fees in terms of the department funding. When we asked how the department should be funded, the majority thought general state taxes. And then a smaller percentage thought we should continue to fund based primarily on licenses. So we clearly have, and it's not that surprising, a gap in terms of people's understanding of how the agency is funded, which leads to a real challenge for us is you're doing a great job, we don't know how you're funded, and so what's the problem? And so that's why we've been devoting so much energy to looking at how we portray the funding challenge that's in front of us, and that's going to be a key part of our recommendations to the legislature.
Okay, so in summary, we're about 3/4 of the way through our legislative charge. We've already provided testimony to one of the interim committees, House Interim Committee on Representative Witt. Got a very positive presentation there about where we are. We will be presenting a report to the legislature in September, and then likely there will be some work done between September and, of course, the February session in drafting a bill to talk about where we go from here in terms of a funding source. So in the next 6 weeks, again, we will be doing this, what we call the soft touch, trying to get input from key stakeholders, fatal flaws, researching legal and legislative implications, developing a program for further fleshing out of recommendations. It's a presentation to the legislature in September, and I'll be giving that presentation to both the Senate committee and the House committee. And then developing informational materials. So I'll give you my perspective right now on, and I've mentioned this to the task force several times, that this is going to be a heavy lift. We all know that. It's going to be a heavy lift, particularly when you talk about taxes or you talk about the bottle bill. It's going to be a heavy lift. We're going to need, when you think about fish and wildlife, there's folks that are on both sides of the aisle on different issues and different concerns, those kind of things. But I think if you ask everybody in the back of this room and you ask the general public, should ODF&W be adequately funded for the long term? And should it be a broader base than just putting it on the backs of hunters and fishers? I think most people would say yes. So even though you may have some consternation on one issue or another, whether it's fishing or hunting or non-game or conservation or whatever it is, we need the interest groups to come to the table and say they support long-term sustainable funding. You can argue about the policy decisions later, but we need to have an adequate funding base for ODF&W for the long term to keep the agency viable. And that's what we want to try to do with the interest groups, because Senator Edwards will tell you clearly it's going to be a heavy lift, And he will be looking at the interest groups, the lobbyists. When a bill comes in and you're talking about raising taxes or changing the bottle bill, there's going to be legislators that are going to be asking, well, is there support out there for this? And we need those interest groups and those lobbyists and those citizens, those public citizens, to come to the table and say, yes, it may not be perfect, but we support that. So that's what I'm trying to, put your guns in your pocket and come to the table and think about the long-term viability of the agency. I might be a little Pollyanna there, but we're going to try. So we're open for questions if you have any.
Thank you, Mark. Commissioners, Commissioner Buckmaster.
Mark, Jim, good to see you again. Thank you both for your work. I would remind again my colleagues and other people in the room that it is possible to watch either live or at your leisure the proceedings of this task force through the legislative. There is a link through the legislative website, and it is fascinating to listen to some of the discussions. The excitement about marijuana money, the depression followed by that discussion, and all of those things. It's a great group of Oregonians on this task force, and they're doing good work.